We got some. Our speakers are so interesting that we ordered, coffee that's got some, boost to it. So hopefully you got a chance for that, so we can keep you awake throughout our presentation. Thank you for coming. We did our last SDC forum in September of 2015, and it was a very successful forum. How many of you were at the forum? Just a quick hand raise. Wow, actually, pretty big group. So out of that came a list of folks that were kind of interested in follow-up, and a commitment from the city to follow up. Man, time flies. I just tell you it does. It's not like we don't have our hands full around here, but this one kind of got away from us a little bit from a follow-up meeting perspective. We have been doing a lot of work between now and then that I think I wanted to, that we'll go over today. But definitely a successful forum, and that's why we're having this roundtable. And Amber's here. We weren't sure if you were going to show up, so thank you for being here, Amber. So in the interim time, we've been working with DKS and Associates, who's our transportation engineer and wrote our transportation system plan, and FCS Group, who's our financial analyst who does a lot of this work for us and around the region. So really, we apologize for taking so long to get back to you. We've had a few landslides and moratoriums and other things like that. So without sounding like I'm making too many excuses, I'm making some excuses. So, but we're back at you now. So welcome to the, what are we calling this thing? The Oregon City System Development Charge Roundtable meeting. So we're started and can move forward. We're going to record the meeting, by the way, so I'm not sure how the cameras are actually going to work for us, but we're going to try to record this. Questions, in order to get them on the recording, we're going to ask you to use microphones, so just be ready for that. And then most of you know where the bathrooms are. I recognize just about everybody, but bathrooms are around here if you need them. So let's see, and I can make this thing happen, right? We're going to ask you to introduce yourselves, so we're going to take a few minutes to go around the room just to get a focus on who you are and what your interests are in system development charges, so we know a little bit about that. We're going to go through the background a little bit and talk about what SDCs and how we got to where we are today, and talk about our rate history. We're definitely going to give you a progress report on what we've been doing between the forum and now. We're going to go through our project list update, and we printed a few copies of that. It's online as well. We also printed a few copies of the PowerPoints. So if you didn't get a copy of that, don't fret. You can download it off the internet. It's on our webpage, along with all the other resources that have been on the website for some time now from the original forum. So I use that webpage to share with other communities. We get a lot of questions about SDCs, what we're doing with our SDCs, how our SDCs work, and that webpage, if you haven't been to it, is really a pretty good resource. So I refer a lot of other agency folks to that webpage too, so feel free to take a look at that. So completed a good list of updates to the project list. The financial analysis, John Ghilarducci is here to talk about that. I wrote down my notes, say he's like the Jimi Hendrix of SDCs. So he's amazing when it comes to SDCs. So
that sets the bar kind of high.
Very high, very high.
I remember that.
I don't know. Do you like Jimi Hendrix? I hope you like Jimi Hendrix, because I like Jimi Hendrix. So that's why I thought that. I want to acknowledge the Chamber of Commerce and the work of the Government and Economic Affairs Committee and the Board of Directors. They've been, I would say, leaning forward on this issue and asking the city to keep this moving and prodding us along. And so they've actually come to the city with some recommendations, which we've added to the agenda. We're going to try and go over I think all of those points in one way or another. So just look forward to that. And then we do hope to get out of here a few minutes early because there's a OCBA luncheon, so I know many of you need to get to that, so we're going to try to do that. Introductions. So I want to acknowledge Dana Webb's been kind of carrying the lion's share of the work activity on this, so she does an amazing job. We also got Laura Turway in the room, Tony, and Wyatt. So there's a wealth of information in the room right now besides myself. So I'm scheduled to do most of the speaking, but if the questions get really difficult, I'm probably going to point it somewhere else. FCS Group, I mentioned John Ghilarducci, senior partner with the FCS Group, and Anthony Martin, who's sitting over here to my right, who's an analyst and been doing some work with not only Oregon City, but most of the regional, the Portland metro areas as well. DKS Carl Springer, who's a professional engineer. Your business card said futurist.
You like that?
Yeah. Wow. I'm not.
I live in the future.
You live. All right. Well, that's good. So, anyway, Carl was the lead behind the transportation system plan, and still our go-to guy for all of our transportation analysis things that we do in the city. Also, I already mentioned Oregon City Chamber, so Amber will do that. But do I need to do anything to this? You know,
Should be on.
Test. No. Doesn't sound like it's on. But it looks like it's on. So I thought maybe we'd just go around and do a quick introduction, your name, who you're with, and what's your interest in SDC.
I've already had a quick introduction. Amber Holbeck, working for the Oregon City Chamber of Commerce. It's not on.
Okay.
Right, the other one out there.
Okay.
Was on.
Test. There you go.
There we go.
Bingo.
All right, here we go. Take two. Good morning. I'm Amber Holbeck, Director for the Oregon City Chamber of Commerce, and we've had a keen interest in this topic as part of our advocacy efforts for our businesses. And thank you, John, for being such a good partner with us in this process.
Are we all going to stand?
No.
Okay. My name is. My name is Jonathan Stone. I'm the Executive Director of the Downtown Oregon City Association, and we also represent the Economic Improvement District in downtown.
I'm Justine Ely. I'm also with the Downtown Oregon City Association, the Community Coordinator.
Thank you. Laura Turway, Community Development Director for the city. I support the Building and Planning Divisions. In the Building Division, we charge the SDC, and on the planning, we work with various entities like the Transportation System Plan when they create the plan. That's it.
I'm Bob LaSalle, and I'm Chair of the Transportation Advisory Committee.
I'm Nancy Ide, City Commissioner, and I'm here to learn everything I can about SDCs and more.
Amy Wellhite, I'm the chair of the Gaffney Lane Neighborhood and the Citizen Involvement Committee, so here to gather information to share.
I'm Jim Bean. I'm an unsuccessful retiree. And my great-great-grandfather moved to Oregon City in 1867. That has nothing to do with anything except we've been here a long time.
I'm Gary Johnson. I'm a member of the Transportation Advisory Committee.
John Anderson, member of the Transportation Advisory Committee.
Tom Batty, owner of the Bike Concierge, a touring company based in Oregon City, and the Chamber of Commerce representative on the Transportation Advisory Committee.
James Adkins, I'm with the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland.
Rick Malinsky with Danielson's Hilltop Mall.
Craig Danielson, Danielson's Hilltop Mall, and a chamber member.
Graham Peterson, commercial real estate broker and chair of the GEAC.
Mark Ellingson, Lewis and Clark Bank, also on the chamber board and GEAC.
Chair.
Oh, past chair, yes.
There's another past chair of the GEAC. William Gifford. Right now my head is in Budgetville, so I'm thinking about the revenues that are coming in and where we're spending those monies. So I'm just here to see what how we're sorting all this out.
Kent Ziegler, President of the Oregon City Business Alliance and board member for the Home Builders Association. And yes, I invite everyone to come to our forum immediately after today's event.
I'm David Green with Citizens Bank here in Oregon City, also a board member of the Chamber of Commerce and an executive board member of the Clackamas Workforce Partnership, which is our local workforce investment board.
Tony Conkle, City Manager for Oregon City.
Wyatt Parno, Finance Director of Oregon City. John, my interest in SDCs is to keep them reasonable and equitable and fair, and also provide some infrastructure that keeps the community in service.
Rah, rah. Let's see.
Brian Shaw, I'm a building designer and a engineer in manufacturing and a city commissioner here.
I'm the futurist. Futurist and analyst. Yeah. So, can everybody read this slide? It's one of the slides that has fairly small text. We have a few like that. So, if you are having trouble reading it, there's 4 empty seats in the front row. I would suggest you come up to the front of the row or front of the room. So just, this is really background for you, but the city adopted SDCs in 1991, and according to John, that's about when the SDC legislation was also effective. So looks like the city of Oregon City was there at the early time. I don't know if that was true across the state, but we were definitely there. So in 1991, we moved into that, and we made some adjustments in 97. 2001 was a pretty big year because they did the first transportation system plan, which was adopted. And interestingly enough, we're still working off that 2001 project list. And even though we did an update in 2009 and a new TSP in 2013, we've still kind of been working off that original TSP list, project list, and we can talk more about that, but we will talk more about that, but really the 2009 work kind of looked at that list. It's my recollect that there were some updates that were done, and we've added some projects since the 2001 transportation system plan. But really in 2009 was when the city really stepped up. I want to say our transportation SDC at the time was around $2,500, and it went to, we phased it in, which we'll show you some of that information next, but it went to over $7,000 per single family unit. So anyway, then in 2013, we updated our transportation system plan. We developed a brand new project list. We really haven't taken that project list officially to the City Commission. We held that list and we used that list, but the formal adoption of that list hasn't really happened. And now we're talking about, through this forum and some of the work that we've done, modifying that TSP list to make it more flexible, hopefully, which is what we've kind of come to realize is more favorable for the development community. But and we've done a lot of work with that, so we'll share that with you as well. So that kind of brings us to 2017, which is where we're at today. So this is another very small text slide, and I can't even read the numbers that are here in front of me, but it's really a transition from the 2009 SDC to where we are in 2017. And at that time, the reason and these are all transportation, by the way, transportation SDCs, no others. But in 2009, we decided to ramp that up, and it was scheduled to go 50% in 2009, and then the remainder of that in 2011. And it's been increasing every year since the adoption based on a factor we call the Engineering News Record. It's a construction cost index for the city of Seattle. So The Engineering News Record is a publication that is often used by engineers and others as a cost inflationary index, and they do it for major metropolitan cities. So it's a kind of a recognized standard. But that's how these rates have increased over time, over year after year, and it's really kind of kept us in check with, I think, the rest of the region. And this is pretty standard for most regions to do that, or most agencies to do that. So that's that slide. That question about how we're spending. So, William, this one's one you might be interested in. How much revenue have we been collecting? How have we been spending it? What kind of projects? We do track this information in much more detail than what's shown on the screen, but we're trying to keep it simple and wanted to go through just a little bit of the history since 2010, and I'm even going to share a few other projects with you, but starting at the bottom of the list and the most recent, some of the project expenditures that we've had, for instance, the right turn lanes that we just built on Beaver Creek Road near 213. That was a project that was funded out of SDC, out of SDCs. In 2015, some of the work that we did on McLaughlin Boulevard was paid out of SDCs. Also, we purchased some property from the county, actually, for Maple Lane, near Beaver Creek Road, so that was another project. We've also, any of the administrative costs, this meeting, contracts we have with FCS Group to do that work, or DKS to do some of the work that we do, we often pay that out of SDCs. The coffee and snacks at the back of the room, just because of this meeting, guess what? We charge it to the Transportation SDC Fund. That's about the minimum of any fund that gets hit for any kind of administration piece. Most of it's project related, and a significant amount of it. So in 2014, we did the Beaver Creek Road right turn lane. So if you know where the at Beaver Creek and Molalla, there's a senior care facility there. We put in a right turn lane. That's right near the Danielson's property. Main Street, when we did between 5th and 10th, we spent some money there over several years. And then, of course, the jug handle. Most of you will remember the jug handle. There was projects, there was funds used for the jug handle project. We did get a lot of grant money for that project as well, but we also provided some match through transportation system charges. Holcomb Boulevard, when we took that from the county, we applied some money to that. Warner Milne and Molalla Avenue, the little intersection project that happened there a few years ago, that was a portion of that we used Transportation SDCs. And then even older projects, Beaver Creek Road between Molalla and Fur Street, so right there by Mart and the car wash and Nelson's. That project was done using SDCs. Myers Road up by the high school, that was in 2007. We did some work on Molalla in 2005, and we did some work on Glen Oak Road in 2004. So lots of project work has been completed using transportation system charges. And like I said, we could do a lot more to audit that if folks really needed that information. But it's one of those funds that's dedicated. We don't have a lot of options about how we use that funding. It's, if it's transportation SDCs, it needs to go to transportation projects and projects that bring capacity in one form or another. Capacity could mean a pathway, or it could mean additional lanes on a roadway. So with that, next slide. Some of the upcoming projects, I think many of you have probably heard about the Myers Road extension, which is really going to complete Myers Road between Highway 213 and the high school. Some of that we were able to partner with the high school on when they built their transportation facility, so we did provide them some reimbursements for the work that they did on the segment, really from High School Lane to where it's a dead end now. The remainder of that, we're probably going to beat the development community to the table, and we will beat the development community to the table, and the city is going to build that whole project. And so that's a pretty big project. We originally estimated at $4.65 million. We've met with the state since, and I suspect we're probably going to spend another, I don't know, $1.5 million on improvements to Highway 213 at the intersection there to add travel lanes. So, and really that's all capacity related, so we'll be tapping SDCs for that additional funding. Malala Avenue, we got a big grant of $3.8 million from Metro. We committed to matching that with $4 million, and we're going to spend $2 million out of SDCs and another $2 million out of our pavement maintenance utility fee. So I think good quality uses of, I think there's not been much debate about that, but I think that's because most folks understand that and are very supportive. It's definitely all capacity-related improvements. There's some other projects that we hit, 12th and Washington, the traffic signal there. There's a small component of that we're going to be able to justify using SDCs. Most of that is not, though. Most of that is a safety improvement and related to the existing capacity needs of that intersection. But there will be some. Some of you have heard about the alternate mobility targets. Dana's been managing that project. It's a challenging project, but it's really about adopting new standards at the intersection of Beaver Creek and 213, and we've also included the Redland Road and 213 project. So we've yet to come to a full conclusion, but we expect to see a project or two come out of that process in addition to a new standard for how we would measure congestion in that intersection. So we recognize that either depending on when this new transportation list gets adopted by the City Commission, we'll either have an alternate mobility project on there, or we'll recognize it as needing to be updated in the not so distant future to include a project at at those locations. And really, I like to use it for some concept planning. We've got several concept plans around town, but they do an okay job of kind of lining out what we might need for infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure. But if you take the South End corridor, for instance, that's a good example. There's several roundabouts shown in that area. How much right-of-way do we really need? So working with usually DKS to do a little bit more corridor planning for that so that we can start thinking about right-of-way acquisition and definitely conditions of approval for development that's going to come into those areas. So we spend transportation SDCs on those kind of projects.
John, I noticed, thanks for the numbers on the top two. Is the reason there's not expense estimates on the other ones because we just don't have those at this point? Or because it was nice to show kind of what the fund balance has risen up to and kind of where we're going to start spending that money, but how much is the rest of that going to cost?
Yeah, we probably could take a better guesstimate at those today. We didn't for this slide. We don't know, for instance, for 12th and Washington, we're about 90% complete with those plans, so we have a pretty good number of what that's going to cost and how much of that's going to be SDC. I don't know it off the top of my head, but we know that one. Alternate mobility targets, we don't know that one. We suspect the kind of projects that we're talking about. For those of you that were participating in that, we talk about a free right-hand turn lane off of Beaver Creek Road onto 213 northbound. $1.5–2 million project there that's likely to be required. These corridor plans, we haven't scoped them, but we did the Lynn Avenue, Leland, Myers Road corridor plan. That was about $80,000. So corridor plans, depending on how complicated they are, can cost us some funding as well. So just know that those are probably smaller projects, but they're out there. And then the safety measures on 99E, we have really worked out an arrangement with ODOT on that, so we know a lot of information on that. We just chose to keep the slide simple, really, but we can put that together. Go ahead.
So if we look at the funding balance at the end of 2016, $7,200,000. We have just about that amount on those first two projects, and I understand that you're spending the money on Myers before you get reimbursed for it when development does happen. Is that correct?
That's right.
So what about the other projects? How will they be funded in the interim, given the nature that the fund balance will have decreased dramatically over these two projects?
So, I mean, there's the revenues, you're right, are coming in. So even for 2017, we've collected some revenues. So that's kind of how SDCs work. We build projects based on what we've got in the bank, right? We're not bonding debt on these SDCs, at least we haven't been. We're really kind of monitoring what's in the bank and trying to budget accordingly. So it's really the 2-year budget for us on this. And we may have longer term plans for other projects. And sometimes it's hard for us to tell, especially on these big transportation projects, really when the project's going to actually have an invoice that's going to cost us something. And, so we try to balance that with our projections of revenues. Wyatt's crew's been really helpful with trying to figure out, that and keep us in check. Another project that's not listed, well, it is listed, the last one, the roundabout at Lynn, Leland, Warner Milne, Warner Parrott. I'd like to get some of that work, at least surveying, figuring out what we need for right-of-ways. So pay a consultant to help us with that piece of it, but probably not go out and acquire right-of-way until we know for certain how the revenues are coming in. So that's kind of how the nature of SDCs, because projections on, what the revenues will look like is a bit of an art, right? Laura can kind of figure out what's coming in the door right now, but it's a 2-year budget, so we take a snapshot and figure, well, let's go with that. But it may be more or it may be less.
John, quick question.
Yes, sir.
2 things, and you can answer them at the end. How set in stone is the priority of the projects that you've listed that have the amounts already identified? But more importantly, if you have projects that are ready to go, that have received approvals through the Planning Commission or the City Commission, but cannot be granted final conditions of approval or receive permits because you haven't got the alternative mobility improvements made yet, or something else on the list has not been done. And I don't know if that's the case, but I think, Tony, at your presentation to the Oregon City Business Alliance earlier this year, that was one of the questions we had, is who's going to pay for some of these things? And we really didn't know. Is there a way to modify or adjust those expenditures? Oh, I'm sorry.
I forgot about that. Yeah, you need
sorry about
gentlemen.
That. But is there a way, if you recognize that, okay, we've got certain projects that are ready to go now, and there's funding in place from the private capital markets to green light them, can you go back in and say, well, maybe we should only do a portion of this particular one that's been identified, it's a top priority, so we can go forward with this other one to generate the revenues from the SDC fees that we collect?
There is some flexibility there, and the other way we deal with a lot of that is through credits, right? So if a developer has a project that they want to move forward, they want the infrastructure in, often rather than when it comes time to get their building permit, they get a credit for their, if it's a large project, let's say it's $1 million project, and they've got $700 or $700,000 worth of SDC liability for transportation, we can apply that there. So there may be a $300,000 gap versus a $1 million gap. So there is a little bit of that, but at least for right now, the 2 projects that are listed there, we're feeling pretty committed to those, right? And that's a pretty big chunk. Things like the alternate mobility target projects and the corridor studies, the roundabout, definitely less commitment at this point in time. We're just trying to keep them moving forward with good work that we can apply for grants, keep those things on the forefront so that they're ready.
Yeah,
but if there was a development that said, hey, I want to build Park Place, for instance, and in order to do that, we've got to do all these improvements that were called for in the TSP for Redland Road, and that's $6 million worth of projects. These are I don't know the numbers, but let's just say that we would have a funding challenge at that point in time, right? If we're committing, over $6 million to some projects here, and we got a beginning fund balance of 7.2, we got a gap, right?
Right. And I think more specifically, I was just kind of focusing on the alternative mobility standard. If that was one of those line items that had to be in effect and improved upon before Beaver Creek Concept Plan could go forward, Park Place Concept Plan could go forward, even if they had their approvals by the City Commission.
Well, the state's going to require us to get those approved, but things like annexation, and Laura could speak to this maybe a little better than I could, and it is maybe a little off topic as well. It's on topic, but it's off topic, and I'm worried about time.
Not a problem.
Can we kind of deal with that one maybe offline? But the point is, the point that I really wanted to make is part of our challenge is, as high as some may think our SDCs are, we struggle. These are real costs, and we're seeing funding shortfalls when we kind of look a little longer term out.
Let's see.
Okay. So this is the first of a few slides on comparatives, comparable SDCs, which are always interesting to look at, but by their very nature are sort of apples and oranges because everybody's needs are different, everybody's systems are different. So we're showing highest to lowest on this list, and we'll show it graphically for you in a minute too. You got a few outliers there, actually one real outlier, North Bethany, but you see Lake Oswego's had a recent increase. There are a number of these which are in the process of changes or have recently changed. Sherwood, Newburgh's not on the list, but Newburgh is they're going to council in next week for an increase to the transportation SDC. We've tried to capture the combination of regional and local where those do exist, and that's usually sewer and water. We're showing the TDT, which is the Washington County Transportation Impact Fee. It's actually the Transportation Development Tax, and where it applies. There are a number of cities you see here in Washington County which add a local SDC on top of the TDT. And then the transportation SDC column, those are all the quote-unquote local SDCs. You see Oregon City's existing charge there, all for a typical single-family residence with the totals on the right-hand side. So just to give you a visual of how these look, give you maybe a different sense of the scale. You see all the different, and SDCs are allowed for only the 5 services shown here: water, sewer, stormwater, transportation, and parks. Again, for typical single-family residences. Some of the other recent updates that we know about: West Lynn updated their transportation SDC. I think it was 2 years ago. Lake Oswego this year. Wilsonville this year. Sandy last year. Banks, was that like last year? Last year.
So Wilsonville's doesn't show up, right? That's the old rate, or is that the current rate?
The current existing, they haven't passed their new SDC yet.
That should happen soon. Okay. Tualatin is undergoing updates of their sewer and stormwater right now, so you can expect those to change. I mentioned Newburgh. Canby's another one that is foreseeing a multi-service update in the next year. I think importantly too, there are a few that aren't on this list. What we've left off the list are these sort of localized overlay neighborhood SDCs, which are maybe a little bit of a trend that we're seeing, and that includes South Hillsborough, which is a very high charge just in that part of Hillsborough. South Cooper Mountain in Beaverton. Again, these are not on the list. They skew it way, way high. Tigard River Terrace, a section of Tigard. There are still, and I think you can go to the next slide to pick up some of these trends. There are still some discounted charges out there, or charges that are in the midst of being phased in over time, increases that are being phased in. I think we've talked about the pros and cons of discounting charges before, but there are some cautionary tales to discounting, and Bend is probably my favorite, just because they had discounted their system development charges almost across the board throughout the 90s, which was when they happened to triple in size. And the problem with system development charges, one of them, besides cash flow, which John already touched upon and how that goes up and down over time, is once you've missed it, the revenue from system development charges, there's no mechanism to go back and get it from the development that's already occurred. So there is some risk to discounting. That foregone revenue is gone. So we have seen that. That said, phasing is a real popular approach to implementing significant increases, stepping them up over a period of years, like Oregon City did with the 2009 update. A trend we're seeing, another trend I guess you could say we're seeing in the industry, and this is specific to transportation SDCs, is this concept of basing them on person trips. So right now, Oregon City, as most, they base the transportation system development charge on vehicle trip generation. And you use the ITE manual to estimate the trip generation by land use, in this case peak hour trip generation, and the SDC is charged based on that trip generation. This has the effect of the kind of multipliers you see on commercial development. That's why you get some pretty high comparative transportation SDCs for commercial development. So because we're seeing so many project lists now with an emphasis on multimodal projects, bike, ped, sometimes transit, this transition to person trips, what we're trying to do is capture multimodal projects in a way that makes more sense than basing them on vehicle trip generation. So before, we would look at a bike ped project and estimate the growth share of that bike ped project based on how much vehicle trip capacity it freed up in the system, which was a very small amount. By basing the transportation SDC on person trips, which includes bike ped trips, transit trips, we can allocate a bigger share of the bike ped projects, multimodal projects, into the system development charge. So, long story short, that's been the biggest change we're seeing in the industry. It doesn't do a lot to reduce the charges on the whole for any type of development. The big impacts you see are if you move from peak hour to average daily trip generation, whether that's person trips or vehicle trips. We've looked at that, at least on a preliminary calculation here, and what that does is it creates a lot of I'll call them winners and losers among commercial customers, because if you think of an office, they generate a lot of traffic in the morning peak hour and the PM peak hour. And so under a PM peak hour basis, they're getting a pretty good comparative system development charge. If you move to an average daily trip basis, that looks at total trips spread out throughout the day. Offices comparatively go down, and other land uses that tend to have their trips spread out throughout the day, those comparatively go up under an average daily peak hour vehicle trip or person trip basis. So that's, I know, a lot of concepts to throw at you, but long story short, two main issues with going to person trips: it allows for a more robust allocation of bike ped projects into the SDC, and if you consider moving to average daily person trips from a peak hour basis, it creates a lot of ups and downs among the commercial customers that are sometimes hard to understand intuitively until you really think about how the trip patterns are. So those are some of the trends we're seeing. We've listed a few other points here. Talked about discounting. We talked about Lake Oswego and Wilsonville already. The TDT is expected to go up with inflation beginning in the new fiscal year, July 1st.
So one thing I want to add to that.
Sure.
So the methodology change, other than mentioning it, we're still kind of trying to figure out what that really looks like. This will probably be the last group meeting that we have before we take some of this to the City Commission in work session form. We may take that methodology piece. I just tell you, there's winners and losers in every one of these scenarios, and it's it's kind of frustrating as somebody who likes to see as many winners as we can. It's the science just doesn't always. It's not intuitive on whether it's peak person, peak trips in other forms. It's average day. I mean, they all kind of have. If you look at the land use types, and the numbers and the various scenarios, they really bounce around a lot. So that'll be a good conversation to have, but we're not ready to really have it right now. Yeah, William.
I'll wait for the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
I have a question about that first one. Slip back, please. That first one about moving person trips instead of vehicle trips. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. It's a two-part question. One is, would the net result of that be to increase the total amount of money for for the transportation SDC, or would it only change the percentage of those monies that are already collected to multimodal? The other question, and the second part of the question is, it seems to me as though although the expense of creating a multimodal facility, such as a bike path or an extra sidewalk or something like that, the expense, my suspicion is it costs a little bit more because it's so finely finished. But I would think that in the long term, the maintenance of multimodal is less because the mode that is walking and bicycling makes less of an impact on the surface.
Okay, I'll handle the first part. The answer to your first question is it depends. If you, but I'll explain that. If you basically any methodology you choose, if you leave the numerator alone, which is, and I know you know this, but the numerator is the sum total of the capacity increasing portion of every project on that list. So if we hold that number constant, then any methodology we choose, the net effect is going to be the same. What we're trying to do is calculate a schedule that will recover that amount of money over the planning period. So it's just a matter of who pays, how you slice that pie to recover the pie over the planning period. Where it depends is under this person trip approach, if you were to go back to the bike ped project list and say, okay, under a person trip methodology, we think that a larger percentage of each of these projects should be SDC includable. And you would say that by looking at the transportation system more holistically than just through the lens of vehicle trips, if I'm making sense. If you go back and do that analysis, which we did not do in this most recent just sort of draft look, then you could result in a larger numerator and a net increase because you've increased the amount to those bike ped projects that's includable.
Maintenance. I guess, William, I think that also depends. I mean, there's a lot of facilities that you're right would probably be less, but if we're talking bike lanes on existing pavement, a lot of our projects are shared facilities, family-friendly facilities, or neighborhoods on existing streets. I guess it depends. But I think I would agree with you in that on average, the pedestrian or the other mobility modes is generally less expensive to maintain because it doesn't have. It's definitely got, you're not dealing with heavy trucks and, snow plows and all the other kind of challenges to that. So. Oh, this.
Okay, so we also. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I had another question. I know this is early on the person versus peak hour discussion, but it seems to me that most of the world's still on peak hour in terms of analysis, whether it be ODOT or traffic engineers or even working through mobility study. We're all looking at peak hour, and we have the debates on how much do we do for just a peak hour. So it seems like there could be a conflict in if the SDCs are based on person hour and yet all of the thinking in terms of what actually is built is based on peak hour, those would need to be somehow synced up together. And until the whole world moves one way, I wonder if we're going to see conflict in that.
Yeah, I'm looking at Carl. See if
we're all looking at I don't disagree.
The existing methodology that Oregon City has a separate bike ped component, and what we tried to do, this was a result of the 2009 work, was recognize that different land uses generate bike ped trips differently than they do vehicle trips. I mean, and we know that's true, but there's just not a lot of good local data. The data we found was from a long ways away. In the interest of sort of being more straightforward and probably simplistic about it, that's where this person trip approach has come from. But it is less. You're doing a lot. It's a lot less refined than that. We're basically assuming that person trips increase proportionally with vehicle trips, which we know isn't quite the case. So I guess I'm agreed. There's a lot of work to be done to make that a better approach, but the idea of it, I think, is real solid, which is looking at the system more holistically and trying to capture it that way. I don't know. Did I say anything?
No,
I'm a finance guy.
I would
too,
agree
so.
with that. I mean, yeah, the data's not there until get it down to a person level of travel. I think maybe the next time the city does their TSP update, they'll be a lot closer. There's a lot of research going on now along those lines, but we're not necessarily there yet. So in my mind, I've always looked at this as kind of an equity issue, because the dollar amount stays the same, as John was saying. It's not like you're adding or subtracting projects. You're figuring out who should pay and how much. And so to me, it's worth thinking about that as an alternative, because if you just look at the vehicle side of the equation, you're really kind of being blind to everything else. So. And ped and bike systems they don't make a dent in the demand for the vehicle system. They're used on a different basis for different demand patterns. So that's why we're trying to move away from just the vehicle focus.
And I don't think we're being totally blind because we've got the bike ped SDC.
Mm-hmm. Right, not here, but I'm just in general.
In general, yeah.
No, not here.
So we also, sorry, Chris.
Just to follow up, Carl, it seems like there's decades of vehicle research and basically not very much for persons.
Yeah, the ITE generation manual that everybody uses for SDC calculations is probably 50 years old, something like that. I could argue that you probably shouldn't be using the stuff that's 50 years old because the way people drive and how they get around is a lot different now than it was back then, but it's a big volume of data compared to what the other piece is.
Well, isn't it? It's a 50-year-old document, but it's informed as information comes in, right? New studies inform that document.
Yeah,
so
it keeps adding on, but you don't. My point was, you don't ever take away the studies that were done in the 1970s in Florida.
Right.
They're still there.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't think of Oregon as Florida, but that's just me.
We have data centers, which we didn't. There's numbers for those that we didn't even have 5 years ago, I don't think.
I guess one of the reasons why we're looking at the methodology, just so this room understands that, is there was this feeling of imbalance between residential and commercial. And the one thing we have seen out of the couple of models that we looked at is there is a slight move in the direction of residential paying a little more, and if we're using the same total dollar amount and we're just allocating the pie a little differently, we recognize that residential on a whole would pay a little bit more, which would mean commercial would pay a little bit less. And that was kind of this group was pretty adamant about trying to find a way to investigate that. So just there.
So we did put together some commercial comparisons also, and these are really hard because there are so many different kinds of commercial establishments. We picked a 2,000 square foot specialty retail. Is that what's shown here? Yeah. And what John said's borne out. If you think about where Oregon City was on single family residential, kind of in the middle, this is transportation only, and it's just this particular type of commercial. But that commercial example moves Oregon City closer to the high for those transportation SDCs. I guess the one thing I'd remind everybody is that these are a snapshot of what we know now, and again, very dynamic industry. Some are in the process of changing right now. If we could show that next one too. We also calculated transportation only SDCs for a typical office. We're calling a typical office 10,000 square feet. And you can see again how that changes the relative ranking of these comparables. Many of these, in case you wonder why, many of these in moving to a person trip basis have also moved to an average daily person trip basis. It just so happens an office is one of those land uses that generates more peak hour trips relative to other land uses than average daily trips. So in part, the way that Oregon City moves to the high end is because of that peak hour basis as opposed to average daily. I guess I would suggest that this maybe shouldn't be the reason to change the basis, that the basis should fit Oregon City's transportation system and the fact that you're an employment center. But that is a policy choice that the city can make to change that basis as long as it's still equitable. But anyway, so some commercial comparisons as well. If we threw a few different land uses up there for you because of those ups and downs, this ranking would change again. That's one of the hard parts of comparing commercial.
You had a quick question regarding that?
Oh, sorry. Right, microphone.
So what's the implication for existing structures in terms of making them more desirable because they're already there, built when there was a lower SDC? So is there some kind of incentive to rehab an existing structure versus create a new one because of the SDC history?
So we'll actually come back and spend some time on that one, but the way that the city handles that now is the redevelopment gets a reduction on their SDC for the amount of the SDC from the previous land use. So that immediately preceding land use is applied against their SDC, and they only pay the incremental addition if they're developing into something bigger. If they're redeveloping into something smaller, they would pay no SDC. So there are some time limits to that and how you can spend it, and we'll come back to that if that's okay. Thanks.
So this slide is kind of a redo. It's really to introduce the project list, which Carl's going to talk about. But again, we did the 2009 SDC project list and methodology, which was really kind of inspired by the 2001 TSP, with some some updates that had happened over the years. Then we did the 2013 TSP update. And I guess the other thing I'd like to say is just we've stuck to that 2009 SDC amount when it came to transportation. Well, all of them, but with that, transportation was the focus in 2009. When we did the TSP update in 2013, the same conversation was happening, feeling like there was SDCs on the transportation side especially were too high. So we developed the funded project list. That we based that numerator number, the total project list, so that it wouldn't change the transportation SDC. And I think that's important for folks to know. We've held steady, and during that, sometimes it's good business. The do nothing approach is good business a little bit, because others have had a chance to update their transportation systems plans, redo their rate and SDC analysis, and that's what we're seeing is others kind of catching up. Oregon City, I think, was really responsible in 2009, and continues to be so. The other thing that the project list includes that we wanted to mention was these other projects. So we've taken into effect all the concept plans that we've done. So the Willamette Falls Legacy Project, Myers Road, we're proposing in this new list to incorporate those projects as well, or what we know about those projects. On the next slide, we're also proposing some elimination of projects that are no longer needed. When we worked with the school district, for instance, there was a Loader Road extension that showed it connecting to Glen Oak Road through a couple of parcels. We said, let's build on High School Avenue. So the school district is now kind of committed to making High School Avenue the other end of Loader Road. So we've reduced that project list, or we're proposing to reduce that project list. Dunes Drive through the Cove. When we did the TSP, there was a suggestion that Dunes Drive should extend through I can't even remember what store's right there, but through the center itself, the buildings themselves, and connect to Main Street Extension at where the roundabout is being built today. We've eliminated that project. And then the Meyer, did I mess this up? Loader Road Extension, Myers Road Extension. I may be getting those two mixed up a little bit. Dana, you remember the difference in those, the top one and the bottom one?
D45 is the roundabout that we removed. So the top one
right,
is the roundabout.
Right. So the intersection of Loader and Myers was going to be a roundabout, and that's no longer the plan for that. So anyway, we hired DKS to update the project list, and that's kind of the next most important piece.
All right. Thanks, John. So let me talk about that. So as John went through the history, one of the things that was common was TSP plans or updates were done, and then SDC updates were done. So the project lists that are carried forward into the SDC typically come from TSP updates. And one of the things we did this time is getting ready for the SDC update was to go back and look through all the projects that were on the list and make sure they had reasonable project cost estimates. Because if you've ever been involved with a TSP update, they're fairly sketch level. I mean, you have just a general basic idea of the kind of improvement you're going to do, and so you put a very low level of effort into developing a cost estimate. When it moves to the next stage and you start talking about funding and what the project really is going to look like, what's all involved, then you spend a lot more energy in thinking through the cost estimate. If there's any engineers or developers in the room, they know that's how that goes. Once you get down to construction, there's a tremendous amount of detail goes into a cost estimate because you're requiring right-of-way, you're buying utilities, you're doing all that stuff. That stuff doesn't really happen at the TSP level. So to get this into a better shape, we used a template that we used to develop for the Metro MTP, the region-wide estimate for doing all projects that go into the Metro list. Because it's a good uniform template that a lot of the jurisdictions in the area use. It gives us better unit cost information about what things really cost. One of my personal favorites is the cost of a traffic signal. So can I just ask this question? So how much would you guys guess a brand new traffic signal cost? If you have a four-legged intersection, stop signs today, but you're going to make it to a traffic signal, what would you guess? 500,000, 500 to 600,000. Things have changed over time. There's a lot of technology out there in that traffic signal, especially now with the ADA compliance requirements on the corners. It's a big investment. So it wasn't that long ago when we were doing a TSP, we would guess 100 or 150,000, and that would be the placeholder in there. But now we're going back and dialing those up to match. So our cost estimate piece went through that to get them a little closer, because I know I hear from John every time our TSP estimates are way low compared to what the actual costs are. I hear a little heartburn back from him. So we tried to narrow the gap a little bit for this one. The other big piece, aside from getting the project cost estimates closer, is to look at the eligibility piece. And if you should be familiar with what the eligibility piece is, that's the piece that gets assigned to growth. There's a technical way to go through that. We look at a corridor and we say, what's the volume in the long range, and how much of that volume is associated with growth? And that's the number we pick on in general. And that ranges throughout the city depending on where the growth's happening, right? So if you're in the downtown area, the growth share there is relatively small, unless you're right next to the mill. But other places it can be as low as 20 or 25%. But if you get into the high growth areas, it could be up to 75, or even in a concept plan, it could even be 100%, because that facility is really there to serve the concept planned area. You wouldn't build it if the concept plan didn't progress. What else do I want to say about this? So in terms of the ped bike piece, the way we went about estimating that was we looked at we went back to vehicle trips. We looked at the share of growth in vehicle trips to the horizon year versus what it is today, and it came in at about 40%. And so that's the piece, that's the number that gets applied to the bike share projects that are on the list. If we could go to the next slide. This looks like a map from the TSP. I think you'll have a hard time reading that, but you have a packet that gives you the list of projects, and it has a code next to it, and there should be a map available like this where you can go find where that code is within the city. So that'll help you locate those things. I think one thing, if you participated in the TSP update last time, one of the big changes compared to where the work that was done in 2009 is we did spend a lot of energy on bike and ped facilities in the city. The community told us pretty loud and clear that that was an important piece that wasn't really focused on as well in 2009. So there's a lot of detailed projects in the TSP now. A lot of those carried forward into the SDC listings. And so when you look at how these things shake out in total, so this slide, let's see, let me try to explain this to you. So the group on the top are the vehicle numbers, the group on the bottom are the bicycle numbers. So 2009, you've got about 92 vehicle projects, and so far right now we have 94 in the 2017 version. The total cost, $312 million back then, $255. The total cost actually went down a little bit. I think that's because some projects were taken out, if I remember right. And eligibility actually went up slightly compared to back then. On the bike side, that's where it's striking, right? So in 2009, you had 96 bike and ped projects, and now we have 274. So it's a lot more bike and ped projects because we took a comprehensive look at not only the growth areas but the existing neighborhoods and figuring how to connect those two. When the growth comes, how are these people going to ride their bikes or walk safely to the places that they want to get to? And so you've got a pretty significant difference in terms of the piece of the cost of the bikes. Back then it was a very low number, especially compared to the vehicle total. So you had $312 million for the vehicle system. You only had $13 million for the ped and bike system. So a tiny share, whereas the ratio in the current layout there is much closer, much more balanced between ped bike and bicycle. So the eligible amount obviously went up because you've got a lot more projects. The grand total that's eligible down at the very bottom line, that's the dollar amount that sits on top of this calculation. Eligibility piece. So back then it was 165 million, we'll say, and right now as it's sitting today it's 205 million. So that's That's an increase over what it was before. Now, that doesn't get down to the actual rate. That's the calculation that's yet to be done in terms of what the trip growth into that would be. I just wanted to lay that out there for you. And I know it's a significant jump at this point. Do we want to ask the group how they feel about that, or what do you want to do, John?
Well, I just think it's the reality of what the transportation system plan went through quite a public involvement process. So if you remember being there, we had sessions where people were putting dots on maps and doing all those kinds of things, and sometimes, but all those projects make sense.
Right.
It's just, at the end of the day, that's $205 million. That's a big number. Maybe bigger than other agencies. I think a lot of that's got to do with our topography and the fact that we're an old city that didn't have a lot of bike and ped facilities associated with it. So, again, trying to keep our neighborhood. I can tell you, top calls, pedestrian safety and bike, not having good access and speeding. Those are what we hear about pretty regularly here. So, I think if you're looking at just pure numbers versus what the needs of the community are, that's pretty representative of what the community has talked to us about. So,
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, back to you, John.
On the next slide, we show how those numbers are used in calculating an updated transportation SDC. Again, these are preliminary, and I guess I'll make one point about the project list too, because of how it feeds directly into these calculations. One of the things we talked about at the SDC forum, and that John alluded to earlier, is the project list just too big? Do we have too many projects on the list? One of the things that the SDC law requires is that you spend SDC money only on projects that are on that adopted list. So, one of the things that I've suggested, I don't know if I've advocated it or not, but I would suggest that instead, if the number is too high, the SDC, that the focus maybe should be on adopting something lower than that rather than taking projects off the list. Because the city is free to adopt a lower system development charge. If you leave the list intact, then the city still has the ability to prioritize and use that money on anything that's on that project list. If you start taking projects off the list, then you naturally reduce the flexibility that the city has to spend that SDC money. So two ways to get to just a lower SDC, if that's an issue, and that one of them leaves the project list intact, which is what I would suggest you consider. Okay, so the math. There are two pieces to a system development charge. In the top part of this table, you see reimbursement fee. That is the buy-in portion. So this is the unused capacity that's in Oregon City's transportation system right now that's already been built. That's where this number comes from. So for roadway or vehicle improvements, that $15.7 million is largely money the city has spent in the recent past on capacity increasing roadway improvements. So that money is now, the next person who develops should buy into a portion of that, or they're getting a free ride on those facilities. So that's a relatively modest part of the number, $911 per peak hour trip. All we're doing is dividing that cost basis, that's the unused capacity, cost of unused capacity in the existing system, by projected future growth in peak hour trips. That's the 17,235 that comes directly out of DKS's work for the planning period. The improvement fee, which is the middle of the table going across horizontally, you see this is the future looking fee based on planned improvements that have not been built yet. So that $166 million is the capacity increasing total you saw from the previous page for vehicle improvements of 255 million, I think it was. 166 is growth related. We take out the city's existing SDC fund balance because we're not going to ask growth to buy into that cash, which is already available to spend on these projects. So that improvement fee cost basis is 159 million. We divide that by projected growth in peak hour trips. The planning period is slightly different because we just updated that project list, so that growth in peak hour trips is a little higher for the improvement fee than it is for the reimbursement fee. We're just dividing that growth into the SDC or improvement fee eligible portion, and that's where that 7,741 per peak hour trip comes from. This is all under the city's existing methodology, none of that person trip stuff. And then down at the bottom of that roadway improvement column, you see reimbursement fee plus improvement fee, and then the addition of an administrative cost recovery factor. That's what allows the city to repay itself for accounting for the SDCs and pay for our study that John was talking about earlier. I'm not going to question his decision to fund the food.
Everybody's going to focus on that.
In the bike ped column, you see that 43,960,000 from the previous page. That was the growth-related bike ped projects divided by projected growth in these. This is an average daily number. That's why it's a lot different than growth in peak hour vehicle trips. We're dividing it by 29,000 projected bike ped trips. That growth gives us our bike ped component, which is a significant increase over the current bike ped component. But again, that one's applied also by land use, but using a different schedule based on projected bike ped trip generation by land use. So, long story summarized on the next page. The city's existing 2017 sample bills are shown in that middle column, and then that newly calculated number applied to, in the top part of this table, single family residential. So that typical single family residence, or actually any single family residence because they're treated uniformly, would go from 8,841.10 to 10,247.57 under this newly calculated maximum. We've taken the specialty retail and the general office examples that you saw in those other comparables and calculated those out as well, so you can see how they would be impacted from 2017 to 2018. This is absent any other of the changes that we've talked about, and we will still talk about. This is just if you were to play it straight under the city's existing methodology.
I'm going to, just real quick, that number right there is a misprint. We found that just in a last minute effort here, so if you've got a hard copy of this, actually that number's right. Yeah. That number's right, but your hard copy has a different number there, so scratch it out and add 114,845,000. And
okay. Okay, finally getting to probably what most of you are care the most about here. Ways to encourage or incentivize development and redevelopment under an SDC structure. And one of the things, there were some suggestions in the Oregon City Chamber board letter to the city. A few of them are shown here. All of them are shown here, I believe. Discounting SDCs for redevelopment, and the city's existing practice right now, as we talked about, is to give credit for the preceding land use against the SDC paid at the time of redevelopment. Give credit against that. I'm saying credit. Give a reduction equal to the amount of the previous land use, the SDC the previous land use would pay. The city had looked back, in the case of a vacant property, the city had looked back only 18 months before a redevelopment would have to pay the entire SDC again. That has since been extended to 10 years. So when redeveloping a vacant site, the city will look at the most recent land use for the last 10 years and reduce the SDC of the redeveloping customer by that amount. There are some precedents around the state for having no time limit at all on that look back. It does create some administrative issues. You got to know what was there going back longer than 10 years, which can be difficult in itself. But there are those who do it. Another suggestion was buying down system development charges using
John,
extra.
Before you jump onto that one, let me step back a little bit to the discounted. So the city offers, just so you know, in our mixed-use downtown, which is really pretty much downtown and up the Malala Avenue corridor, 7th Street, up that whole area. Right now we have what I consider a discount. The city passed a resolution that supports that mixed-use downtown, the theory being that if you're in a mixed-use downtown area, you may live and work there. Now, we haven't seen much of the live in the mixed-use downtown area yet, but that's a goal, right? So the idea would be that you would have more folks walking to work or walking to whatever they were wanting to, business they were wanting to use. And so everything in the mixed-use downtown corridor gets the land use, the whole area gets the shopping center rate, which is on the overall commercial land use designation a lower rate. So just that's one discount that I think we already do.
There's a 10% discount for development in Malala corridor too for mixed use, right?
Isn't that's the same discount, right?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it could be more than 10% if it's for instance, if it's the highest one that I can think of is usually drive-through coffee, right? Because they generate a lot of trips. If you're in the mixed-use corridor, you still get the shopping center designation. So that could be more than 10%, right? Mm-hmm. I guess the other note that I made was concern for discounting of a particular group or land use without a methodology that supports it. Is it legally defensible? I hear that from John all the time. I'm like, man, can't we just cut a deal here or something? No, John, it's not legally defensible. So I think that's important for folks to think about. And then this is another area where I think the city of Bend represents, maybe in their history, I don't know if it was discounts or just not updates to their SDCs, but you get into that same kind of problem where you still got the capital liability needs. So how much of that do you discount? So that's all I wanted to say. So,
and as far as buying down system development charges using other funding, the point, when a city is considering discounting SDCs, if they do that, they have the power to do that as long as they apply it uniformly to all types of customers. And this gets back to there's language in the statute that says you have to use rate-making principles when you're calculating an SDC. So we're getting into theory of rate-making here, but that's what that's about. You have to treat the customer base uniformly unless you have a cost-based or impact-based reason to discount certain parts of the city. So if there was a temptation to discount SDCs in a section of the city like the downtown, an area that you would, as a city, want to encourage redevelopment, that's fine, but that should take the form of buy-downs to those SDCs, and you need an external funding source to do that. So the city could say, we're going to take general fund money and we're going to buy down SDCs in the downtown core. I'm making this scenario up before Wyatt flips. And that is considered, that preserves the integrity of the SDC program, more so than just creating subsidies within the SDC program. So you can't discount a group and leave everybody else's SDCs the same and not pay for that buy down somehow, because if you don't do that, you're damaging everyone else who doesn't get the benefit of those discounted charges. But the city can do those things by policy if there's not a as I said, a cost-based reason for doing that. So many of these, which might be frustrating to some of you, are just policy choices the city can make, how to either offer discounted charges or discounted charges in certain areas that are funded through external sources. Lower interest rates on bankrupting. I think that's pretty straightforward.
I can cover
Yeah,
that
go
one.
ahead.
But before we go there, I just wanted to add a few notes on this buy down idea. So, for street funding, we get gas taxes, pavement maintenance fees. Both of those are pretty much dedicated to maintenance of facilities, or in the gas tax case, your everything from your street sweeper to your pothole repairs to your striping, all those kind of cover those things. So they're really kind of fully tapped resources that we don't have funding for. The question that always comes up with this buy down is using what funding stream, and as you know, on a lot of these, there's a lot of projects that we have. There's an SDC component that we can fund because we're generating SDC revenue. But if it's a project that's 50% SDC funded and 50% something else, it's that something else piece that we struggle to fund. So I've thought, well, if the county passes a vehicle registration fee, maybe there's an argument to be made for, picking those key areas and you use a small piece of that. I don't think there's ties to how we use that other than we use it in transportation. Maybe that's a way to help fund a buy down. But we don't have that yet, right? We don't have that decision. And then the other flip side of that argument is, man, we got a huge unfunded liability already. We need to, spend that money. Urban renewal is another form. We don't know the future of urban renewal, but we like to think positive thoughts. But urban renewal has a whole set of goals, and so far I haven't seen transportation funding or transportation SDC buy down on the urban renewal commission's list of priorities. So I'm not really sure about that one. So it's kind of like, where does that come from? And that's our budget. Well, Wyatt can speak to this better than I can. But what I know in my department and what I'm seeing in other departments is it's every penny counts right now, and it's very, very tight. And I'm sure many of you are going to go to the budget hearings because Wyatt's putting on that dog and pony show, and it's going to be a good one coming up on May 1st. Is that right, Wyatt? May 1st. So anyway, I will just say I love the idea of the buy down because you can focus on particular areas, but we got to figure out how to fund that, right? And I think it's if you question that, feel free to come to the budget committee meetings and give Wyatt an earful on that. I don't know. And I'm going to acknowledge Wyatt on this one because I know he's busy. He's got budget on the mind, but he was willing to come to this for a few minutes. And do you want to talk a little bit about the bankrupting piece, Wyatt, since you're here? And
Sure.
You're the expert, and they believe you a lot more when it comes to this kind of stuff than me.
Thank you, John. Is that on? Is the mic on? Okay, so just to recap what you said, though, I think one of the problems with the buy down option, because I like that one as well. I know Tony and I have talked about that. He does too. But to summarize what you said at the beginning is a lot of the projects are partially SDC funded, partially other funding, and we have a lot of trouble coming up with the other funding. So if we had a lot of money for the other funding, we might even have some money for the buy down option, but we just don't. So when those scarce resources become available, we use that for the other part of the project, unfortunately. Regarding a lower interest rate, I appreciated that request because it'd be my intent to do everything we can to provide more tools for businesses to be able to locate, particularly with financing. The problem is, from a community perspective, creating an artificially lower rate for lending was problematic for the city. So when I came 4 years ago, we just had a huge number bad debts that accumulated. And so a lot of the businesses, the businesses that are represented here are, sufficiently capitalized and intelligently approaching their businesses. And for those folks, although we had a couple that we still ran into problems, we don't have a problem. But we have to offer the same program to everyone. And folks were coming in and defaulting on their loans. And the issue is really because the city isn't established to have a solid underwriting process. So if a bank isn't willing to loan a company money, to require the city to do it at a lower interest rate, in fact, is just not good policy. And who ends up carrying the burden is the taxpayers, the community, because then we're using their dollars to ultimately have to pay for those SDCs that defaulted. So we just don't have the resources to chase around bankruptcies and defaults and things like that. So that's why we're really hesitant to create an artificially lower interest rate. We do use the state's established rate for those financings, and it's been successful in some cases. But I think the most productive thing is we offer that program, and folks if the preferred method would be to get financing from your banks, because they're the experts, they have the underwriting staff. So hopefully that helps that question.
So the last 2 points. Oh, sure. Sorry. The last 2 points in among those made by the Chamber's Board of Directors had to do with SDC credits and reductions. So this is just to define the 2 types of credits that are offered related to system development charges, and talk about the years that folks have to quote unquote spend those credits, and what changes could be made in that regard. So the first one, which we're calling credits in that upper part of this table, system development charge credits by statute have to be provided when a development provides a qualified public improvement as a condition of developing that property that's on the project list, and they build it bigger than their development needs. So basically, the city has to give them credit for the oversizing portion of a project that they build while developing their property. That when those credits exceed the amount of a system development charge that development would pay, they get a carryover. Is that what we're calling it? Carryover. Carry forward. Thank you. I knew that was the carry forward. So that's basically a paper amount that developer can then spend on the next development that they do. The law, Oregon Revised Statute, says you have the maximum amount of time that you can allow a developer to spend those credits is 10 years. The city allows 5 years. So that is an area the city could choose to go out to 10 years and still be within the statutory limits, and it would give developers more time to spend that carry through that they earned by building a qualified public improvement as part of their initial development. So that's one area that could be changed to the benefit of developing customers. Okay, so those are credits as defined in the ORS. This other concept, which we're calling reductions, I've myself called them credits at times today, but these reductions occur when redeveloping a site and, as we talked about, getting the benefit of the SDC that would have been paid by the previous land use or was paid by the previous land use. So in this case, you're redeveloping a property, you look at the existing or immediately preceding land use, you calculate the SDC that they would have paid, and the redevelopment pays only that incremental increase in the system development charges. As we talked about, the city allows you to look back 10 years. So if that property is vacant, you go back 10 years to find the most recent land use, and they get the benefit of that most recent land use against their SDC. As I mentioned, there are many examples of folks that don't have a time limit on that at all, which creates some problems. The statute is silent on these reductions. They're common practice, but there's nothing in the law that requires that you do them or not do them. And you really get into issues about when has at what point have you truly purchased capacity for a site that carries on forever, as opposed to 20 years later, is that capacity really still there in the system, or should someone hooking up have to buy it again? Because everything is different and the system's been built to serve needs as they've changed over time. So that two different types of credits or offsets and different time limits, again, limits that could be changed as a matter of policy by the commission.
Can I ask your question? And I'll keep it short.
I follow the credits as they go forward, the 10 years and the 5-year. My question would be, for example, I'll utilize one of the concept plans, whether it's Park Place or Beaver Creek. Park Place is probably a better example. Let's say that the connection from Holcomb Road to Redland Road, as outlined in your project list, is built by the developer at the cost of $18 million. This is how it's outlined here. But let's say he only owns 10% of the property in the Park Place concept plan, but he's building the entire collector road. How does he go about collecting from the other property owners that will be hooking up later on as they develop their property into that expenditure?
So my understanding of the city's policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not, the 10% ownership throws me a little bit, but what the policy as devised in that 2009 study would say that the build out of that area served by that improvement, the SDC's paid as that area builds out, because as each person pulls a building permit to construct in that area, that is the mechanism of reimbursement or redemption to the credits earned by that initial developer. If that's not enough to fully repay them, then we can't be pulling money out of the general SDC fund. They only get cash redeemed for that, for the build out of that area. They'll still have that amount in excess with which then they can spend on their next development within 5 years.
But let's say it's Farmer Joe, and he's not going to do another development.
Right.
But in order to develop his property, the city conditions him to go ahead and put in this emergency road connection for fire trucks and police vehicles and ambulances. And he wants to go forward with his project. But over time, the neighbor decides to hook up. And I was involved in a situation like Oswego where someone else put in a sewer line. I hooked up within a 10-year period, and I paid a latecomer's fee to go ahead and utilize that infrastructure improvement that was paid for by somebody else. And I've chatted with Wyatt and I've chatted with John about this in the past. Is there a present mechanism in the city's system that allows for latecomers' fees?
So the city has some options there. We'd spent a long time since we've done a local improvement district, or since we've done I think here we call it a reimbursement district. So those are two options, and I think they make sense in that scenario. We can't take the SDC rules and regulations and apply them to that. The further away this development is from the existing infrastructure, obviously the cost of that goes well beyond what I think this language was kind of intended to deal with. So the question, though, could come, how then do you reduce your, so let's say you built a reimbursement district and you built that $18 million worth of project, and you assess that to, through either a reimbursement district or an LID, then the project list
and should go down, right? That next time we look at that project list, those project expenses are being covered in a different way. So, that's the effort that would have to be put forth, and that would probably more likely come through a bigger development agreement. And what you're talking about, Kent, has been done before. I think there's a model for it. We would, it would be some new uncharted territory for us, but it wouldn't necessarily lean so heavily on what we're talking about here today.
Got it.
Okay.
Back to on the reductions portion there. Let me ask you the question. If we have a look back of 10 years, but we don't have an actual SDC fee didn't exist prior to 1991. Why would we look back beyond 1991? To me, that's the inception of what the credit should be for. So would that at all be considered as part of that look back period? Because it then ties it directly to when the SDC was originally, the concept was in place.
Yeah, I guess I kind of agree with that, Mark, because to me, anything that happened before that, there was a lot more federal funding available for a lot of these bigger projects. A lot of communities were built, roadways in particular, old county road sections. We've improved them over time using gas taxes. But I agree. If we're going to do a look back, is 10 years the right number? We argued that a couple years ago. I think it's a good number. It helps us on the front end of verification. Transportation's typically about the particular land use, which is sometimes hard to verify. You go back too far. Could we go back 15, 20 years? Maybe. It just gets that much more, even if we put the onus on the developer to prove that, just the verification can be problematic. It's usually tied to square footage. Can we use aerial photos to kind of get there? Okay, probably. But it just puts a lot more onus on the agency to figure that out. Other SDCs, sewer, for instance, I always use the example, if it's restaurant, it's tables and chairs or number of seats or something like that. A lot harder to verify some of those things. And and especially if we're in the shopping centers, that gets hard to figure out. Now, maybe the shopping center owner has a lot of information on the history of that, so that that could be. But then it just becomes the burden of proof and how we're dealing with that. But I agree, if we're talking about reductions and recognizing that the state legislature doesn't have something there, I think the conversation with the city commission needs to be. This is a policy decision, but I kind of agree. We shouldn't be going back beyond 1991.
Craig was raising his hand too there. Sorry.
I just had a question. My understanding on the credits and the reductions, it's to the property, not to the developer or the person.
I want to say that
because we were told you couldn't sell credits.
They are not transferable.
Yeah.
So they are to the property then.
They are not transferable to a different developer. But there's some leeway in the statute, so I'm not sure what.
And my recollect of that is reductions are for the owner of the property. Credits are for the property. So an owner of the property can use. So reductions. I'm developer A. I got a bunch of reductions in my pocket in a letter form. And I've got another development over there. I can use them over there, right? And but I can't sell those, or I can't give them to another developer to use. That's how reductions work, right? On credits, my recollect, you're checking this, right? They stay with the property. So if you've got a piece of property, you have to use them on that. You can't transfer them to the other piece of property that you own, 4 doors down.
Question, when you do the credits, are they based on the SDCs that were paid, say, $4,000 6 years ago, or are they based on the current SDCs that reflect inflation?
The current. So if you had a restaurant and you built it 10 years ago and you want to develop a I don't know, doctor's office. That's an inverse, but yeah, they're today. They're based on today's. So you get the square footage based on today's rate of the prior use, and then you're charged based on today's rate for the current use.
The other point I was going to make, Corvallis has a lot of experience with developers financing extended facilities, infrastructure, and so if you want examples of that, they probably can answer some of the questions this gentleman had back here on how the mechanics of how it works.
So what I read here, back in response to what Mr. Danielson was saying, okay, on the credit carry forward, an SDC credit carry forward shall be issued by the director for a particular dollar value to the developer who earned the SDC credit and may be used by the developer to satisfy SDC requirements for any other development applied for by the developer within the city. SDC credit carry forwards are not negotiable or transferable to any party other than the one to whom they are issued. So you can't transfer them to another developer, but you can use them on any subsequent development in the city. Okay.
So that was opposite of what I said.
It's close to it. Just backwards.
Doesn't talk to the doesn't talk to the reductions.
Code doesn't lie.
Is there anything on the reductions?
I'll check the reductions.
Well, he's checking that. Let's keep moving. We're really in the nick of time here. So this is there's some policy decisions yet to be made.
The reductions apply only to only against the SDC paid at the time, and there's no carryovers allowed for those. So it just reduces the SDC you're paying at the time of redevelopment.
Okay. Yep.
Sorry.
So the commission's got kind of a lot to consider here in the future. I think what I'm calling these development encouragement methods, kind of the things that came out of the chamber letter. I think the credit reduction piece is obviously something that is, I won't call it low-hanging fruit, but it's one of those things that seems like there's some opportunities. This idea of methodologies and which methodologies we choose, we're going to bring that in more detail to the City Commission. Just want you to know that and participate in that as you need to. Separate SDCs for concept plan areas. We heard from this group at the forum that wasn't such a great idea, and but we still hear about it individually from folks. So I don't know what the commission might think about that idea, but there's other areas that have done it, right? It's kind of a trend. And then I think we really need to talk to the commission about what comes out of the alternate mobility study. I think that's a citywide need and concern, and it may have an impact on the final numbers. So we'll be talking to them about that. That's kind of coming up. And then we haven't really laid out a detailed schedule, but I tried in an attempt to answer that question for you. But really, I think some kind of a work sessions, scheduled yet this year, probably in the summertime. We could go to the commission with the list adoption, which I think is well overdue anytime. And so we'll probably try and get that on about that same time as well. But really, SDC changes to any kind of code or methodology are going to require public hearing. So that's more likely to happen in towards the end of 2017. I think we've been moving in this direction. We were actually going there, and then it was oh yeah, we got to talk to this forum group. They were interested in participation. So we're kind of dealing with that. But yeah, so look for more to come in 2017 with regard to SDCs. Amber, you have a question, because that's perfect, because we have a question slide.
Perfect. And no, we didn't rehearse it. So on the rate comparison slide for 2017 versus 2018 projected, I assume that is based on the existing methodology for Oregon City.
Yes.
And likely there hasn't been any ballpark estimates in terms of if we were to change to the the person trips. Is there any way for us to guess, are these numbers going to change significantly? I guess I'm having a hard time leaping from that present methodology to the potential methodology and what that looks like in real dollars.
So I can, is it okay if I give a preview of that? Okay, so we've done some draft analysis looking at peak hour person trips versus average daily person trip approaches. The order of magnitude changes, I guess, really aren't much. So for single family residential, for example, real similar to that 2018 column, where you see the differences are, and so the PM peak hour person trip approach will line up pretty well with that 2018 column because it's still based on peak hour trip generation factored up for other modes of transportation. It's the change to average daily where things really, and so oddly enough, single family residential still about the same. It's all the other land uses that go up and down, sometimes pretty dramatically because of that shift from peak hour to average daily. And some of those land uses that stand out are like office is one that would go down under an average daily trip approach. Retail goes up, yeah, and then schools go down.
Schools go down, retail goes up.
Yeah. So, but it's, we've got a list of probably 60 to 70 different land uses in the schedule, and all those non-residential land uses hop up and down. Yeah. So that's about all I can tell. But the overall magnitude, real similar to what's in that 2018 column.
One thing I'm putting it in common terms of the difference. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seemed like if you're a business that has one person and one trip, like a dentist office, right? You go to the dentist, you typically don't bring your family with you, right? Unless you have to. But you typically go and you're the one. If you're a business that has maybe a carload full of people, then it's more impactful, like hotels, right? Hotels might have a family full of people, but they're in one vehicle. So
Theaters, restaurants.
Yeah, so that's how I was kind of recognizing it. But it's hard to look at this list. It was hard for me to look at the list and figure out. And then thinking about all the different property owners and what their interests might be and how do you, there's no way to make anybody happy with the methodology change is you're gonna have just as many folks that aren't gonna like it as are gonna like it.
Medical offices is another one that goes up under average daily, right? Because you've got people going in and out to appointments all day long, as opposed to and from the office at the beginning and the end of the day. They're and of course there's an ITE code separate for those types of offices that allows for that resolution whether you want it or not.
I think one of the things that John mentioned was, you got to look at your community and what it really is. Oregon City has, it's an employment center. Commercial is much bigger than what it would be for a lot of other jurisdictions. We've been talking a little bit about this residential element, and it seems like our residentials are average, but our commercials are high. How do we, so the methodology, what really got us looking at that was the residential rate and the recognition that we seem to be really on the low end or middle end of that, soon to be low end, and so how do we balance that with the needs of the community? Go ahead.
Couldn't you just compare, say, the last 3 years to figure out the plus or minus figure in the end? Use the new methodology as applied to the last 3 years of development? Compare the two?
To see in terms of the revenue generated, kind of how it you could do that.
We haven't had a lot of commercial development until early the last couple of years. Right? Laura, is that kind of accurate? So, welcome. We're just about to wrap up. Sorry about that. We'll be happy to talk to you one-on-one if need be. So, is there any other questions? We really wanted to get feedback, kind of field some of these things, get a reaction to that. But it's really about taking this to the commission and trying to get some policy decisions made on this. And we think we're moving in the right direction. But if you think differently, let us know. With that, you got 5 minutes to get to Oregon City Business Alliance. Lunch starts at 11:30.